Everyone, we're going to start right on time. So first of all, let me say on behalf of the Siam Society Lecture Series Committee, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you this evening to a talk by Graham Jefcoate. Tonight, our speaker will guide you back in time to a very different Bangkok from the one we know today. Even those of us who have witnessed decades of change can hardly imagine life in our city of angels in the early 20th century. Graham's latest book, entitled In Bangkok, Siam's Capital Through Foreign Eyes, 1899 to 1935, is full of valuable insights. And the book is for sale in the back, and the author has kindly agreed to sign it if you purchase one. So I'm sure that that would be a good idea for you if you'd like to have a copy. Reading his book, I was impressed with his detailed research and varied information. I feel Graham introduced us to a puzzle and puts the pieces together by covering so many facets of Bangkok life. His book juxtaposes a varied spectrum of opinions, both positive and negative, about the city and its residents. Graham Jefcoate is originally from England, where he studied English and library science in Cambridge and London. His particular interest in Thailand began when he became head of the early printed collection at the British Library in London in 1997, when he also served as a committee member of the Anglo-Thai Society. He is retired and currently resides in Chiang Mai, where he spends his time researching, writing, and lecturing. Many of you already attended the talk he gave last year about the other book that he edited, entitled Enchanted Land, Foreign Writings About Chiang Mai in the Early 20th Century. And incidentally, hopefully there was going to be a plan to do a trip to Chiang Mai following this book with Graham, but it had to be canceled because of the floods. So hopefully later this year, the trip will be organized, and it will be, I'm sure, very interesting. Now I would like to invite Jeffrey to share with us more about what foreigners wrote and thought over 100 years ago when they came to Bangkok. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. I think we'll do another microphone check. Can everyone hear me? Right, okay. As Jane mentioned, In Bangkok is an anthology of texts by foreigners about Siam's capital, roughly in the years 1895 to 1935, which everyone here will recognize essentially the final years of King Chulalongkorn, Rama V, and the reigns of his sons, King Vajravut, Rama VI, and Prajarapok, King Rama VII. The book came out in Bangkok last year, in October last year, published by River Books. And it will also appear in the UK and in the US in a few months' time. As Jane mentioned, it's really a companion, you could say, to Enchanted Land, which was published in 2023, which is an anthology reflecting the foreign experience of Chiang Mai in the north of Siam. And I will be saying Siam and Siamese rather than Thai and Thailand and Thai, because that, of course, was what the country was officially called until 1939. So this evening, what I'm going to do is briefly explain the background to the book, how it's organized, read a selection of the texts, introduce some of the writers, and summarize some of my own conclusions. I'm also going to be referring to the Siam Society itself and the importance of its collections in compiling the book. And I'm immensely grateful to Jane here, not just for the introduction, but she's kindly agreed to read a couple of the texts, and to Philip Cornwell Smith, my colleague author at River Books, who is going to join me in some of the readings as well. Now, to make the technology work. Okay, so if you look at the list of contents of the books, you'll see that I've linked texts in around 50 sections with headings, some of which are obviously intended to intrigue the reader and lead you into the book. It's framed by chapters reflecting the lives of foreign residents and visitors, their travel to, arrival in, and departure from Bangkok, their first impressions, their work, everyday lives, social life, and relationships. The remaining chapters broadly deal with the city and its people from the perspective of those foreigners. You can read the chapters in sequence, and there's an obvious logic in doing that, but you can also dive into the book at any point, really, and read it. Some people have said they like to keep these books by their bedside and dip into them and dip out of them, and so on and so forth. So you can do any of those things. There's an excellent index by my London friend Janet Andrew, which helps you navigate around the book by subject or person, if you want to do that. There's also a bibliography, some suggestions for further reading, should you want to go into some of the topics in more depth, and also some recommendations for visits to explore various locations and neighborhoods. And as you can see from the picture, my partner and I have been spending 2 years exploring some of the lesser known, well, for us, lesser known neighborhoods in Bangkok, and as you probably realize, this is in the Kudujin area in Thonburi of the Siamese or Siamo Portuguese district on the other side of the Chao Phraya. So the book is not a guidebook. There are other guidebooks, some of them published by River Books, to guide you around the built heritage of Bangkok. But I hope that this book will encourage you to do that. Okay, so many of our early 20th century writers set out to answer a question, and that question was, what is Bangkok like? They were asking the question rhetorically because they thought their readers would be interested in the answer, of course. Now, they often came up with epithets, some of which we still use today, which they hoped would characterize the picturesque aspects of Bangkok. City of great white angels, Venice of the East, I'm sure you've heard that one, Jewel City of Asia, City of palaces and temples, you can see many of them here, and Heavenly Royal City. Now, some of these, like Venice of the East, became established clichés, but none of them really seem very helpful in characterizing early 20th century Bangkok. In 1903, an American missionary tried to answer the question by listing impressions, so sights and sounds and smells, both pleasant and unpleasant, and by describing the city's unique atmosphere. And Jane is going to tell us what that person said. Yep.
I shut my eyes and see temple and palace roofs spread out under the sky, like beautiful rugs with harmonious borders, their graceful curves and finials unlike those of any other land. I see the boats and waterways, palms of many species, naive human life in the open air, soft bamboo bowers, ragged, beetle-chewing respectability lounging on verandas, dirty surroundings of homes, ugly women, languid motion, houses slipping down the banks into the water, brilliant blossom trees, religion towering into watts embodied in multitudinous images and chiming bells.
Thank you, Jane. Well, as you can hear, trying to get this back up there, as you can probably agree with me that that's not a bad evocation of the atmosphere of Bangkok. But there were others who took a very different view. And one of them was the gentleman sitting in the group on the left. Now, this was Walter Armstrong Graham, who was involved with the Siam Society in its early years. He was a British civil servant who spent his entire career in the service not of the British but of the Siamese government. And there he is sitting with his minister, one of the princes, and another of his British colleagues. Graham was the author of the Bangkok entry in the edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, published in 1911. That's the classic Encyclopaedia Britannica, most people feel. And also of the comprehensive Siam, a handbook of practical, commercial, and political information. Can you see it on the right-hand side? That was originally published in London in 1912, and this second edition appeared in Chicago a year later. In Graham's description, he emphasizes not the picturesqueness or the squalidness of Bangkok, but rather its modernity. There were indeed beautiful Buddhist temples scattered around the town, but Bangkok also boasted many fine modern buildings, 4 railway stations, a complete system of electric tramways, and streets which were lined with shade trees and lit by electricity. Foreigners often praise modern buildings, which at that point were designed by Westerners, such as this one, the Ananta Samakam Throne Hall, which was completed in 1915. In this photo of about 1920, one of the resident British merchants or businessmen has parked his Austin 20 in front of the building and near the bronze equestrian statue of Siam's great modernizer, King Chulalongkorn, which had been cast in France in 1908. As many visitors remarked, Bangkok was not an ancient city. The young Chakri dynasty had established a new capital here only in 1782, some 15 years after the fall of Ayutthaya to Burmese invaders. Foreign missionaries, diplomats, and merchants had gradually taken up residence, as they had in the old capital. Notable dates being 1828, when the American Presbyterian Mission was established, and 1856, which was when the first British consul was appointed under the so-called Bowring Treaty. By the early 20th century, Bangkok's status was assured. According to A. Cecil Carter, another British civil servant in the service of the Siamese government, it had become the chief city of Siam in every sense. It is the chief port, the chief commercial centre, the centre of government, and the principal residence of the king and the royal family. The Bangkok early 20th century foreigners knew, however, was configured rather differently to today's metropolis, as Jane implied earlier. Many of the areas which are now most familiar to residents and visitors and tourists lay beyond the boundary of the city as it then was. Today, for example, our building here, the Siam Society's building, is overshadowed by skyscrapers and stands near Azok, one of Bangkok's busiest intersections. Not so when it opened in 1933. Then it had been located on the city's outer edge. In an address on leaving Bangkok in November 1932, Reginald LeMay, the Society's vice president, imagined the satisfaction members will derive from sitting in the Society's new home in the cool of the evening with nothing but paddy fields and invigorating breezes between them and Pak Nam. This might be a vibrant area today, indeed it is, but I suspect few would come here to enjoy its invigorating breezes. As we can see from this map printed in Leipzig in 1914, early 20th century Bangkok extended not very far towards the east, but rather towards the south and the southeast along the left bank of the Chao Phraya. So here is Ratakozin, and the city extends here, and there isn't very much to see where we are now, really, at the time. So yes, that's where the palaces, the great palaces and temples, the ministries and so on and so forth were. Sampeng was where many Chinese people lived and had their businesses. The Bang Rak is down here, where many Europeans had their businesses. And the area of Surawong and Silom roads, which is here called the European Quarter. Can't see that. Have I chopped it off? Can you see here? European Quarter down here. Along here is where the foreign trading companies had their compounds, such as one of the best known ones, the Borneo Company Limited. All these districts were linked by New Road, which is, you can just about see along here, Charoen Krung, which was laid out first of all in the 1860s for the convenience of the Western merchants. Now, just as Charoen Krung was generally known as New Road a century ago, at least by foreigners, so many locations familiar with us today were quite often known under alternative names. The river itself, the Chao Phraya, was very often, as here, just called the Mae Nam, which just means river, of course, but that's what they knew it as. I think it's very intriguing that the large open space up here, which is here near the Grand Palace, which we know as Sanam Luang, which is indeed an ancient designation for the space, was rarely, if ever, called that by foreigners years ago. Writers and photographers mostly refer to it as the Phra Maru or Pramain ground. I don't speak Sanskrit, so I understand that is an attempt to make an English version of two ways of transliterating the Sanskrit. But essentially it designates that this was where the royal cremations took place. However, on the Leipzig map, it's called the kite-flying oval. That's because it was closely associated at the time with Siam's national sport. Not boxing, as you might think, but in those days the national sport was held to be kite flying, which is very interesting. We'll come back to that later, perhaps. These differences should perhaps alert us to the possibility that a century ago foreigners did not see or experience Bangkok in quite the same way as we do today, nor indeed in the way that we might imagine they did. As a symbol of Bangkok's modernity, its public transport network Graham used it as a case in point. Since the mid-1890s, Bangkok's districts have been linked by suburban trains and by an electrified tram service, as you can see on this map, printed for the Siam Electricity Company, which ran the service in the early 1920s. Whether you can see this, I've tried to highlight the cover. There's the colours. There's clearly a red line, which goes all the way around Ratakozin, a yellow line, which you may not be able to see very well, which goes from Hua Lumpong station roughly to here, and a blue line, which goes all the way down to Bangko Lem at the end of the line along the river, linking the European areas and the foreign compounds. And there was also a rather intricate system of suburban railways. And the whole thing comes together in a hub at Hua Lumpong station. Now, Hua Lumpong was where many of Bangkok's residents and visitors would arrive in Bangkok, having taken the southern line of Royal State Railways, which connected Bangkok with Penang. At Penang was where you caught or came off the ocean-going liners sailing to or from Europe, at least in the 1920s. In this picture, quite often reproduced, I have to say, you can see the express from Penang. You'll have to believe me that we know it's from Penang because that says Pre, I think, or Prai, I don't know how to pronounce it, which is the station for Penang. And you can also see that the building survives today. It's here. We took this a couple of weeks ago. It's obscured by modern structures, but the same building is here. These are the mails which have just arrived from Europe. Now, on arrival, some visitors found Bangkok difficult to grasp. An example was the distinguished author Somerset Maugham, who actually first came to the city in very early in 1923. He found it strange, flat, and confused, and he was singularly unimpressed by some of the more recent urban improvements, and Philip's going to tell us what he said.
What they've aimed at, you see in the broad avenues, straight, dusty roads, sometimes running beside the canal, with which they have surrounded this conglomeration of sordid streets. They are handsome, spacious, and stately, shaded by trees, but they have no reality. There is something stagey about them, so that you feel they're more apt for court pageants than for the use of every day. No one walks in them. They seem to await ceremonies and processions.
Thank you, Philip. Well, others referred to Bangkok's dual personality. This was quite a common theme. Noel Wynyard, who came fresh from England in the mid-1930s, passed through Bangkok on her way to becoming the wife of a teakwallah in the north. And she said that Bangkok was both crude and disgusting by day, but also a fairyland by night. She's describing the lighting along the river, I suppose. As for the population of Siam's capital, this also caused confusion. People came to Siam knowing that it was the capital of an ancient Buddhist kingdom called Siam and expecting it to be full of Siamese people. Instead, what they found was what they received or understood to be essentially a Chinese city, because, of course, it had been the focus of Chinese migration for many decades. The first Bangkok census in 1909 found that the province of Bangkok had about 1/4 of the population of Chinese heritage, but that proportion was in the city itself was much greater. Some people said that the city was a kind of sister city to Shanghai or Singapore, and it was those cities, both in effect colonial creations, with which Bangkok was indeed often compared. Now, Europeans were much less in evidence. The 1909 census identified only 1,604 European residents of the city. By Europeans, of course, they included also Americans. However, their impact was clearly much greater than the number might suggest. Understandably, it is this small resident community that provided much of the material I've included in Bangkok. If diplomats, missionaries, and teakwallahs were the groups most strongly represented in the north of Siam, and therefore in enchanted land, then Bangkok's resident Westerners were engaged in a much wider range of businesses and professions. They included the so-called advisors working for the government, people like Graham, I mentioned earlier, but also numerous specialists, lawyers, physicians, engineers, artists, and architects. To these should be added the employees of the various international trading companies. Now, this photo of about 1895 comes from a private album, which has never been published, and it shows a group of employees of Western businesses, some of whom are clearly Europeans and some of whom may be of mixed race, I don't know, but it shows a good selection of the kinds of guys that would have been here in the last decade of the 19th century. And this is a quotation from an American journalist called Andrew F. Freeman, who describes such men like these rather caustically in the 1920s. The majority are clerks and business workers whose limited abilities made competition too one-sided for them at home. They were forced by economic necessity, not by the lure of the East, to make a living elsewhere, and readily signed a 3-year contract with passage paid, guaranteeing them a larger salary than they could earn at home. In other words, what he was suggesting was the Brits who were coming here, mostly they were Brits, were not exactly top-notch. They were coming to Bangkok for economic reasons. I happen to, I can tell you that this guy is almost certainly called George, and he actually died quite soon after this photo was taken, and he was the kind of, I think, the 9th son in an enormous family, English family. So he was right down the pecking order as far as going to schools and universities was concerned. Anyway, by the beginning of the 19th century, these Westerners such as these, had established their own religious, medical, social, and recreational institutions and had started a flourishing English language press. A majority of them, like the guys here probably, were Anglophone, though many Europeans were represented, and especially Danes and also Germans, at least until Siam declared war on Germany in 1917. Now, although, as we all know, Siam avoided formal colonization, European enterprises, such as those that these guys worked for, were considered by the government essential for the country's development. Because of the importance of the Danish East Asiatic Company, which through its subsidiaries ran many of Bangkok's utilities, including the trams as it happens, some describe Siam as almost a Danish colony. 70% of trade, however, was with Britain and its empire, and many male members of the Siamese elite were sent to school in Britain. The government also employed British teachers to run many of Bangkok's elite schools and colleges. So it isn't surprising that English established itself in the early 20th century not only as the language of commerce, but also as a second language of government. The second major source of material included in Bangkok comes from what we might call temporary residents, travelers and tourists. In 1928, the Bangkok Times remarked that there was no end to the visitors in Bangkok who feel impelled to write and subsequently print their impressions of the jewel city of Asia. So it became a bit of a cottage industry, writing up your impressions of Bangkok. The city's improving accessibility by sea and rail had encouraged international travellers to visit it. In 1904, Carter had observed their numbers were increasing year by year. After the Great War, the number of visitors increased further. Tourism was promoted by the Railway Information Bureau of the Royal State Railways. As you can see, the Railway Information Bureau, which had its headquarters, this was there was a branch office in Phia Thai Palace, which was by this date a hotel, of course, and the head office was in Hua Lumpong. The Railway Information Bureau was, as I said, a department of the Royal State Railways, which was itself a department of the Ministry of Commerce and Communication. Now, until the 1932 revolution, this was the domain of the energetic Prince Purachat. And it appears that the prince entrusted the development of Siam's first tourist policy largely to Reginald LeMay of the Siam Society. LeMay had joined the ministry from the British Consular Service in 1922, and so he became yet another example of a British civil servant in Siamese government service. The Railway Information Bureau first published a guide to Bangkok by the Dane Erik Seidenfaden in 1927, and by this time companies such as Thomas Cook were including Bangkok in itineraries of world tours. Here you can see Bangkok by the river, Siam's capital, etc., etc., etc. So a lot of the clichés are coming out there. And they are, of course, using, very interestingly, Wat Arun. As I've suggested, foreigners, whether residents or visitors, did not necessarily react to Bangkok in the ways we might assume that they did. The British artist F.S. Harrop was yet another British civil servant working for the Siamese government. This time he was an artist, and he worked as an art teacher in the service of the Ministry of Education during the 1920s. His painting of Wat Arun was actually reproduced in a government-sponsored handbook published in 1930. In the painting, Harrop clearly refers to the beauty of the temple's form, as you can see, in the twilight. But he also includes the urban jumble that surrounded it along the Chao Phraya, all this stuff and this stuff here. Generally, observers found Bangkok's palaces and temples rather less impressive than we might imagine they did. Ruth Rickover, an American visitor in the late 1930s, for example, writes this about Wat Arun, and Jane was going to tell us.
We ended our tour with a visit to Wat Arun. From a distance, it glitters and looks as if it were covered with jewel-encrusted mosaic. Unfortunately, as one approaches, the jewels turn out to be bits of glass and pottery glued to the masonry in shoddy fashion. One ought never to look closely at Bangkok Wats, but from a distance, they are magnificent.
Rickover was clearly living at a time before mosaic collage had become a recognized art form. Now, like Enchanted Land, In Bangkok draws not just on what we might call travel writing, but on a wide range of documentary sources in a variety of genres. They include official publications, directories, memoirs, novels, short stories, magazine articles, verses, and inscriptions. It also draws heavily on reports and advertisements from contemporary newspapers, both published in Bangkok and overseas. I've included a considerable number of photographs and reproductions of contemporary artworks, such as those of F.S. Harrop. The text is sometimes introduced and briefly annotated, but as far as possible, I've allowed the writers to speak from them, for themselves. An indispensable source is the Bangkok Times, which I've mentioned, I think, several times already. It aspired to be the country's English language newspaper of record, and it's also stuffed with wonderful advertisements such as this one, which shows that masseurs in the before World War II were masseurs rather than masseurs. In other words, they were mostly men. But it does show that spa culture was possibly much older than we believe it to have been. I'm extremely grateful to the Siam Society for permission to produce advertisements from its copy of the Bangkok Times, and also from its rare copy of Siam from Ancient to Present Times, this one here. I'm not going to attempt to read the Thai for you. This is the souvenir volume to the aborted Siam Kingdom exhibition that was to be held in Lumpini Park in 1926, which got cancelled by the new government after the sad, unexpected death of King Vajravut. For some time now, the Siam Society's library has made its copies of PDF copies of the Bangkok Times available to members online. It's an absolutely wonderful and indispensable service for anyone doing research into this period. I thought it might be appropriate to say something about the newspaper as a source in that case. Here, both photographs come from another indispensable source, something called 20th Century Impressions of Siam, which is an illustrated directory published in London in 1908. And this is what the 20th Century Impressions says about the Bangkok Times. And these, by the way, are the illustrations of the newspaper and the newspaper's office from the 1908 directory. The Bangkok Times, which is the oldest established newspaper in Bangkok, and may be said to have the largest circulation among the European residents, was founded by Mr. T. Lloyd Williamson in January 1887. It has been considerably enlarged and now comprises 8 pages containing 48 columns. The editor of the paper is Mr. W.H. Mundy, M.A., and he has 2 European assistants, Mr. R. A.D. Moore and Mr. E.B. Gattenby. Yeah. Now, the British lawyer Gerald Sparrow, many of you will know the name Gerald Sparrow, rather famous person living in Bangkok up into the 1960s, I think. He was appointed by the Ministry of Justice in the later 1920s, and he described the Bangkok Times in the following terms.
The Bangkok Times, which had the lion and the unicorn over its leader and was British subsidised, edited by a fine old Scotsman called Mundy, was a little paper, but it was in the tradition of the Times of London. It was cautious and unemphatic. Earthquake in Japan, it would declare, said to be severe. The only subject on which the Times was apt to let itself go was royalty, Siamese royalty. I liked the Bangkok Times. It was snobbish, accurate, faithful, and discreet.
Around 1920, the American travel writer Henry L. Foster approached Mundy, who he mistook for an Englishman, for a job, but got short shrift. I can't do American accents, I'm afraid, so you have to bear with me. Imagine this in an American accent. The editor seemed rather surprised at my informality in approaching him without introduction. No, he explained, they did not require a reporter, never used one, in fact. The subscribers themselves supplied most of the copy notes about their social doings or the score from the cricket matches. He did not go out looking for news. He rather employed that any paper which deliberately went out to hunt for news was an undignified sheet, and that I had insulted his paper by suggesting such a thing. From our perspective, the fact that the Bangkok Times drew its material from the community might seem an advantage, although in reality much of the copy must have been written by Mundy and his two colleagues. In Bangkok makes considerable use of the reports in the newspaper and also on the advertisements, such as this one, or the one on the previous slide, which cover much of its 8 pages. In this sense, the book continues in the footsteps of anthologies of material reprinted from the Times by the American writer Steve Van Beek, who covered the period from the 1890s to about 1901. Now, making a choice for the readings this evening has not been easy. But I've selected 2 themes reflecting the foreigners' reactions to Bangkok rather than descriptions of their own lives here. Now let's start with the traffic problems, Bangkok's traffic problems. Some of you might have assumed that these are relatively recent. For example, the people who had difficulty in getting here this evening. Not so, they are much older. In his book, The Dragon and the Lotus, the Cornish writer Crosby Garstin, who came to Bangkok in 1926, remarks, Bangkok has been described as the city of magnificent distances, which is another way of saying it takes half an hour to get anywhere. It takes considerably longer than that today. Paul Drennan Cravath, a wealthy New York lawyer who visited Bangkok a year after Garstin, elaborates. It is a distinctly modern city, laid out on a most pretentious scale, with numerous public squares and several wide avenues flanked with rows of trees. So great are the distances, one wonders how the business of the city was carried on before the advent of motor cars, with which the dusty streets now swarm. A few years earlier, the journalist and travel writer E. Alexander Powell had described Bangkok traffic in more detail.
The streets of Bangkok are crowded with vehicles of every description. Ramshackle and disreputable rickshaws, the worst to be found in all of the East, drawn by sweating coolies. The boxes of wood and glass on wheels, called gharries, drawn by decrepit ponies whose harnesses are pieced out with rope. Creaking bullock carts, driven by Tamils from southern India. Bicycles, ridden by natives whose European hats and coats are in striking contrast to their bare legs and brilliant panungs. Clanging streetcars as crowded with humanity as those on Broadway, and motors of every size and make, from jitneys to Rolls-Royces.
In 1923, the Straits Times of Singapore remarked that in Singapore you have your traffic problems, but for sheer unadulterated congestion, come to Bangkok. Here, the British Army Major W.R. Furran, I'm not quite sure how he pronounced it, reflects on the traffic situation in the mid-1930s. Like all modern places, Bangkok has many grave traffic problems to be solved and overcome. Many of the streets are far too narrow to accommodate the increasing volume of traffic, and the practice of placing electric street lamp standards and telegraph poles in the center of the highway only only serves to accentuate the dangers. There are many of these obstructions at the junction of two roads, these compelling motor vehicles and transport to make a wide detour around them. Accident follows accident, for the view of the road ahead is badly obstructed. In 1923, a correspondent of the Bangkok Times observed there are plenty of motor cars, no speed regulations, and no tar on the roads. Nevertheless, according to the British journalist Walter B. Harris, Siamese drivers showed considerable skill. The motor has suddenly invaded the country, and the driving of the young chauffeur, he means driver, is stupendous. The government was taken by surprise at the sudden influx of cars, and no traffic regulations were ready. A good many people were taken by surprise also in a more unpleasant way. The Siamese drives well, it must be allowed. From a trick driving point of view, he escapes 99 accidents by a hair's breadth for every one he indulges in. So these are some photos. That's an advertisement for one of the early Fords imported by the Bangkok Dock Motor Garage. Many people associate the Borneo Company Limited with the teak, which it harvested in the north of Siam, but in fact it made much more money importing Ford cars through Bangkok. This advertisement, we decided wasn't clear enough to. Sorry, this illustration here of a man being flattened by a car, we decided wasn't clear enough to reproduce in the book, but I thought I would show you here. Now, quite a lot of these accidents, I'm afraid, were caused by British drivers and were attributable, I'm even more reluctant to tell you, by drunk driving. So I've included some of the rather nasty stories in the book, stories which we find in the Bangkok Times. Now, then as now, public transport was seen as a partial solution to traffic congestion. As mentioned already from the mid-1890s, Bangkok possessed quite a sophisticated network of electric trams and suburban railways. Antonio's 1904 Bangkok Guide called the trams an immense boon to the Bangkok public. The 1932 of Seidenfaden's Guide elaborates on the theme.
By using the tramways only, the visitor can easily and cheaply reach nearly every place of interest in Bangkok. Besides which, trips by the tram are full of fascination for the visitor who wishes to learn something of the peoples of Bangkok. We say peoples because the trams are always found packed with passengers belonging to a variety of races, nations, and creeds. Here will be found sitting together yellow-robed Siamese monks, long-bearded Arabs, sarong-clad Malays, voluble Chinese who would appear to keep no secrets from the outside world, and yet keep many, dark-skinned Tamils, Burmese, Mon, the Penang-clad Thai, and members of a host of other races. These, for a newcomer, form a picture of unending interest.
On the other hand, the travel writer Lucy Chandler, writing in 1916, described the city's tiny trams in less than flattering terms.
All along the street leading from New Road to the palace crawls the tram car, like a mechanical toy on the verge of a strike.
I'll come back to this picture, which you may recognize later. Now, before coming to the second theme I've chosen, allow me please to make a short excursus into the theory of travel writing. This is where the lecture gets a bit more scholarly, and so apologies for that. Many of the texts I've included would probably fall into this category, though scholars struggle somewhat to define what travel writing actually is. In their introduction to the Cambridge Companion to Travel Writing, 2007, the writers don't try to define their topic beyond stating that writing by travellers is a broad and ever-shifting genre with a complex history which has yet to be properly studied. Not very helpful. Indeed, they seem to deplore that it can't be easily or satisfactorily defined. As one might expect, the Cambridge Companion to Post-Colonial Travel Writing of 2017 examines post-colonial and also gender theories as they relate to travel writing. The scholar Robert Clark points out that it has become almost axiomatic for some readers that travel writing has been deeply implicated in naturalizing and celebrating the ethos of European hegemony over the last 500 years. Now, such readers would certainly have no difficulty in finding material in Bangkok to support what we might call a post-colonial critique. But I think we might also propose a more nuanced approach here. Resident foreigners in Bangkok, such as Reginald May or Mundy, William Hackett Mundy, the editor of the Bangkok Times, clearly had a particular contemporary worldview, but it seems far-fetched to attribute motives to them consistent with naturalizing and celebrating the ethos of European hegemony. Even if Mundy, for example, retained British nationality, he was hardly an outsider, being tied to Bangkok through long residence, spent his entire adult life here, family ties, he was married with a young son, and personal inclination. He obviously loved the country. If post-colonial critics might seem to be on stronger ground with writings by temporary visitors, such as journalists and other professional writers, then I'm not sure that the purpose in travelling to Bangkok was necessary to celebrate the ethos of European hegemony. In practical terms, they would have been in search of saleable stories and would naturally have chosen copy that appealed to readers and publishers or potential publishers. And that brings us to my second topic, which is the image of Bangkok's underworld in what we might call American pulp fiction of the 1920s and 1930s. Now, according to a character in Henry Harvey's 1923 novel, The Black Parrot, you can see the cover on the left, it was here in Bangkok's underworld that you might find the real Siam, not the Siam of guidebooks. The Blue Book magazine, one of the best selling American pulp magazines of the period, introduces George F. Wirtz's story, The Panther of One Claw, here on the right, which was actually published in the same year as The Black Parrot. The magazine itself trails it as a highly coloured story of dramatic events in a tropic seaport. And the story begins with a description of the Blue Grin, an establishment, presumably fictitious, found on the banks of a fetid Bangkok klong. Right, and you might be able to read the text from the slide. Lucrative and foul and sinful was the sign of the Blue Grin. Peopled with yellow phantoms and white fools, it was perched like a bird of prey, an evil sprawling bird, on the bank of a blackish, gurgling klong, which floated garbage and sewage from the city of brilliant diamonds into the coffee-coloured Manam Chao Pra when the tide ran out, and which, when the tide ran in, drank back the garbage and sewage again. There was no form of recognized vice that you could not indulge in the Blue Grin, as long as your money lasted. Whether your tastes inclined towards strong drink, the black smoke, fan tan, or merely painted ladies, or all four. In the old days, a sailor from a ship in port overnight could spend a month's pay handily and get his money's worth in the Blue Grin. Fantan, by the way, was a popular card game, and it represents here gambling, which was then regarded by many as Siam's national vice. I'm not going to make any comment about present government policy. Black smoke refers, of course, to opium smoking. Visits to opium dens seem to have been almost obligatory for visitors to early 20th century Bangkok, and they are frequently featured in the travel writing. In fact, I've included a number of them in the book. Prince William of Sweden, for example, who came to Bangkok to attend the coronation of King Vajravut in 1911, was accompanied on his expedition through Bangkok's underworld by the chief of police, who at this date, Bangkok's police commissioner was Eric St. John Lawson. Both he and his deputy were British. Opium dens were not, of course, illegal, but rather licensed by the government, the sale of opium being a government monopoly at this date. However, Bangkok's reputation as a den of vice and iniquity was, I think, almost certainly overdrawn by writers such as these because that's what their audiences expected. We can go into the expectations. Orientalist is the word. Expectations about the sinful East. One visitor, for example, observed that opium smoking was actually rather rare and almost entirely confined to the Chinese community or people of Chinese heritage. Writing in 1929, Lieutenant Colonel Cecil Heber Forty, who was another British police officer, though then retired, observed,
"Visitors to Bangkok who expect to find the hectic scenes of vice and depravity, sometimes described by novelists as the usual things of the East, will be agreeably surprised at their absence, or chagrined as the case may be."
A contemporary visitor agreed.
"Bangkok is said to be a moral cesspool, but I do not think it's worse in this respect than other metropolises in the East or in Europe."
The point here is that professional writers like Harvey or Waltz were writing copy to meet the demands of the market and to fulfill the expectations of pulp fiction consumers. It is hardly surprising that they chose not to write about Bangkok's modern rice mills or canning factories or the city's rapidly improving sanitary conditions. One of the most interesting and nuanced accounts of a visit to an opium den can be found in Siam and Cambodia in pen and pastel by the British artist Rachel Wheatcroft. Now, Wheatcroft happens to be a favourite of mine. It's her picture which you find on the cover of the book. It's one of her rather splendid artworks. She spent several months in Bangkok in the mid-1920s. She made in her book she not only reproduced these splendid pictures, but also made some very apposite observations about Bangkok's people. And it's with Wheatcroft, that I would like to finish these excerpts from In Bangkok. She was an unmarried woman in her 50s who travelled alone and financed her travels by teaching art at Anglican missionary schools through the East. That is one of her paintings, which you can see, which is reproduced in her book. While in Bangkok, she held an exhibition of her pastels and drawings at the Oriental store. That was the stores of the East Asiatic Company. The Tea Room was a well-known place for little art exhibitions, and she held an exhibition of her pastels, including flame trees and temples in Siam and it actually got extended by a week. It was so popular. Nevertheless, it's very unlikely that she sold many of her artworks, because she also did an exhibition of her paintings in London after her return, though sadly we have not been able to locate any examples of her work in public collections today. So these reproductions, and they are very fine reproductions, I think, in her book, published in 1928, are all that we have of her artwork. But perhaps that is not such a bad thing, as it compels us to look at her artwork in the context of her writing. Now, the next slide shows a rather wonderful pencil drawing of the King's birthday celebrations in 1925. And this is her description, her evocative description of the same scene. Whether illuminated by electricity or with a soft glow of coconut oil, for HM's birthday, the streets in every direction were decorated as they might be in England on the occasion of a jubilee or coronation, as were also the palace gates of princes and nobles. But best of all were the open spaces round the old palace, crowded with people in gay attire, the rich in cars and the poor in double rickshaws or on foot. Everywhere, bright-coloured pasin or panung were visible, and the priestly yellow, for priests and students are prominent figures by reason of the robe that sets them apart. In the streets were itinerant vendors too, sellers of foodstuffs, sellers of sweetmeats, and best of all, the men running in and out among the people, the hands full of those familiar joys, great brightly coloured air balloons, held high for the safety above the heads of the crowd. The crowd, though so gay, was astonishingly quiet. Even the Chinese, noisiest of the noisy in their own country, seemed under the spell of national quiet. There were bands, and here I made my first acquaintance with Siamese music, very pleasing rhythmic melodies, in which the problem of perpetual motion seems to have been solved in contrapuntal themes of great charm and ingenuity. I think you agree that's a splendid bit of writing, and it describes, it complements very beautifully her picture. As we draw to a conclusion, I would like to thank my fellow readers this evening, Jane and Philip. Thank you so much for helping me with the readings. Maybe, I'm suggesting here, Philip's in Bangkok should be read in conjunction, my Bangkok in Bangkok should be read in conjunction with Philip's very Bangkok, the second edition of which is due out imminently, I understand, because his book invokes the sights and sounds and also explores the modernity and dynamism of modern Bangkok in the way that our writers this evening described similar scenes from 100 years ago. Thanks, of course, are due to River Books and its publisher Kunying Narissa Chakrabong. Is Narissa with us this evening? There she is. Thank you, Narissa. Narissa it was who suggested the project as a follow-up to Enchanted Land. Thanks to the whole team at River Books, and especially to Rutairat Nanta, known as Fon, who I've seen, yes, hello, thank you, Fon, who designed the book very beautifully, I think. And needless to add that Associate Professor Komsam Terabapong, also waving right over there, has been my companion on the field trips to around Bangkok and has contributed many insights into the city of his birth. I think we learned together a lot of the highways and byways of Bangkok. As it will be apparent by now, in Bangkok is not a systematic history of Bangkok in the early 20th century, but rather a mosaic of impressions, memories, and observations about the city and its foreign colony by foreigners. The texts reflect foreigners' experience of Bangkok, their insights and perceptions, but also their misperceptions. The coverage is not comprehensive, and some imbalances and omissions will also be apparent to anyone familiar with the history of Bangkok and its foreign communities. Like its predecessor, In Bangkok is intended to be read and enjoyed. It is not a scholarly edition to be studied. That being said, I hope the book is found informative. It is characteristic of anthologies such as In Bangkok to include entertaining anecdotes. I told you a few this evening, which emphasizing, as you might say, the weird and the wonderful. I have tried to avoid including too many of these, tempting as it is, in favor of a more balanced account, but readers will find many themes they might find surprising, perhaps even provoking. For example, Bangkok as a sort of modern Babylon remains a present-day trope, but who might have guessed that it was its modernity which impressed many visitors a century ago, as it may be today. I've arrived in Bangkok with friends who've been astonished by this 21st century city. And I'm sure many readers will be surprised to learn, as I was, about the electric car exhibited by the Siam Electricity Company in 1911, complete with charging point. history, as I always say, isn't necessarily about what we think it was about, let alone what we think it should have been about. So back to our original question, if the various colourful epithets applied to Bangkok by pulp fiction writers or tourist brochures seem inadequate, how should we characterise early 20th century Bangkok? The geographer Alistair Macmillan, who visited the city in 1922, concluded that its inherent contrasts and contradictions rendered any attempt to describe it convincingly all but impossible. In fact, Bangkok was probably best understood by acknowledging those contradictions, bringing together, as the city did, the Orient and the Occident, beauty with scholar, the Siamese and the non-Siamese, tradition and modernity. Others reflected on the changes in Bangkok's urban fabric during the period and on the impact of the West on Siamese culture and society generally. These changes, contrasts and contradictions are surely the defining characteristics of early 20th century Bangkok. And as experienced and recorded by the city's foreign residents and visitors, they are the central themes of In Bangkok. Thank you.
การลงหนังเฉลิมไทยไปทางถนนมหาชัยเพื่อจะไปทางสามยอดเห็นภูเขาทองอยู่เบื้องหลัง
the final day of the tram in
หลังจากที่ได้เลิกรับส่งผู้โดยสารมาหลายสายแล้วสายรอบเมืองเป็นสายที่เลิกรับส่งผู้โดยสารหลังที่สุด
The tiny tram on the verge of a strike.
โสพลเจนพาณิชย์ถ่ายภาพผมแท้ประกาศวุฒิสารกำกับการถ่ายภาพรถรางผ่านมาถึงท่าโลงโม่ท่าเตียนมีโบสถ์พระนอนวัดโพอยู่เบื้องหลังคนขับรถรางแกโบกมือกับช่างภาพเป็นการอำลาแล้วก็ผ่านท่าราชวรดิตข้างพระบรมมหาราชวังผ่านโรงกษาปเก่าผ่านอนุสาวรีย์ทหารอาสาสงครามโลกครั้งที่หนึ่งมาหยุดรับส่งผู้โดยสารที่ใกล้ๆสนามหลวงการถ่ายภาพวันสุดท้ายของรถรางของผมนี้ได้มาสิ้นสุดที่เชิงสะพานพระพุทธยอดฟ้าเราเคยได้ยินเสียงรถรางได้ยินเสียงระฆังรถรางเสียงนั้นก็เงียบหายไปตั้งแต่วันที่11กันยายน2511ผู้ที่คุ้นเคยกับเสียงรถรางต่างๆคงจะเงียบเหงาไปบ้างสวัสดีครับ
There we go. All right, thank you.
Well, thank you so much for such a lively and fun and interesting talk, and it makes us realize the rich sources that are still there. You'll have to do a lot more research for us, because you've already found a lot, but there's got to be a lot more, so we'll look forward to more stories. But I'm sure people have questions, so we'll have a question period. Anybody? I see we're hand in the back. Yeah.
Can you hear? Oh, yes. Good evening. Thanks for the lecture. I have a question. Why did you start the book in 1895 and not in 1852 when King Mongkut starts? Because change, I mean, Bangkok start to change when the King Mongkut became the king.
First of all, the book was conceived as a companion to the Chiang Mai book, which covers roughly the same period, very roughly the same period. And secondly, it would have been a book which would have been several times the size, I fear, of the present one. I'm particularly interested, the period that I'm interested in is the early 20th century, rather than, I didn't want to take it too far back into the 19th century. The books by Steve Van Beek, who anthologized the Bangkok Times, do cover the 1890s and continue up to, I think, about 1901. So I'm really talking about the early 20th century, which is when many of these innovations can be traced. However, you're quite right, the process started with King Mongkut and New Road and the Bowring Treaty and so on in the 1850s and 60s, yes.
Thank you very much for your colorful extracts from the book. The subhead of the title is Siam's Capital Through Foreign Eyes. I wonder why you choose the word foreign as opposed to Western. Does the book include any non-Western point of view?
That's a good point, yes. I did think about Western eyes or Farang or whatever you want to call it. Yeah, I can't answer that. We settled on foreign. Yeah, no particular reason.
Is there any plan to cover like non-Western point of view?
Not by me. I mean, I master 3 European languages, but that's it, I'm afraid. It would be very interesting if someone took up the challenge and considered Chinese sources, Japanese sources, and possibly Burmese sources for early 20th century. That would be a different book, beyond my expertise, I'm afraid.
Thank you very much. Because I asked because there could have been many interesting, like non-European Asian visitors to Bangkok around that time.
Absolutely.
Because
yes.
Thailand had the unique position of being independent, well, nominally independent country around that time.
There is some. I mentioned in the preface. I sort of bow to that point of view, and I do include accounts by a number of Asian visitors, which you will find, and you will find a small chapter about the visit of Tagore, the Nobel Prize-winning writer, whose visit to Bangkok in, I think, 1926 was an extraordinary event. Yes, it was a visit by a great Asian to an independent, non-colonial Asian country. It was widely reported, and there's a lot to say about it. But I merely sort of touched on and pointed to the subject. You're quite right. There could be any number of books about from different points of view. Yes.
Yes, and to add to that, there's also Subhash Chandra Bose, another Indian independent fighter who actually started his independence movement in Bangkok, and also Sun Yat-sen, who also came to raise funds for the revolution in China.
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you so much for that great presentation. I'm looking forward to reading the book, with great joy. I represent Assumption University, and our origins go back to Assumption College, which really began its, education mission in 1901, and something of which you mentioned about the reasons why British travelers came and then settled down, also I think is recorded in a very attractive sketch by one of the brothers of St. Gabriel that operate this place, that several British teachers taught in Assumption College, as it was called. Now, another fact that I'd just like to establish is that last year, Bangkok marked 242 years of its history, all right? And I guess that there is a commemorative book published by the Siam Institute, the Royal Institute of Siam, on the sketchings in the Bangkok temple, Emerald Buddha temple. You tend to portray a lot of the external reflections on images and the impressions of Buddhism as a religion. Did you find in your research any of the inside temple impressions or anything to do with, royal occasions or whatever. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, there's a considerable amount on both subjects in the book. Also about Assumption College, Assumption Cathedral. The texts I've included are excerpts of texts, so they're never very extensive. But you will find material in the book on all of those subjects, and one just hopes that they will lead people on to looking at them in more detail. But yes, I'm very interested in Assumption's history. The picture which we felt we shouldn't include came from the L'Écho d'Ascension, which was the school magazine in the 1930s, the one with the car crash. I found that on the internet. Someone's digitized it, but we felt we weren't able to include it in the book. Yeah. So Assumption Cathedral and is one of the obviously one of the most important locations through which foreign influence and the two cultures came together. Yeah, clearly. Thank you.
So maybe time for one more question if there's anyone else.
Can we just say that River Books have brought copies of the book, which are available at an enormous discount down at the exit, and I'm very happy to place my signature on the title page of any of the copies, should you like me to do so. Philip?
Yes, I got a question. There have been literary companions before, and some of them have felt like they've been retreading the same authors, and they're all the sort of ones that have got the rooms named after them in the Oriental Hotel. How much of this book is fresh sources that you've dug out yourself that haven't been in other books?
I tried to avoid anything that had been in other books, apart from the only author which you will commonly find in those is Somerset Maugham. I looked into his best-known quote about about a spa, about massage. And I find it doubtful, I have to say. So actually, I think I can put my hand on my heart and say that very few of these texts have previously been anthologized. But I agree with you that there is a tendency for people to recycle existing stuff. Yeah.
Just take one picture. It was very, very